The first time Elena Ashford noticed the elderly woman, she was standing just inside the doorway of the Lumiere Cafe with 2 torn grocery bags at her feet. Bright oranges rolling slowly across the polished floor, while every customer in the room quietly stepped back, as though they sensed something wrong they couldn't name. Elena watched from behind the counter, a tray of dirty cups balanced in one hand. Nobody moved to help. A businessman nudged an orange aside with the toe of his shoe and walked around her without looking up from his phone. A mother pulled her young son back by the collar when he tried to crouch down and reach for one of the rolling fruits. An elderly couple at the window table simply looked away and returned to their tea, as if ignoring the scene hard enough might make it politely disappear. The woman herself stood absolutely still in the middle of it all. She was dressed far too elegantly to be treated this way. A black embroidered cloak edged in gold stitching, ruby jewelry at her throat and ears, silver hair swept beneath a dark hood. Her posture was straight and practiced, the posture of someone who had commanded rooms for a very long time, but her hands, wrapped tightly around the torn bag handles, were trembling. Elena didn't think. She set the tray down on the counter, ignored her manager calling her name from across the room, and crossed the floor. "Here? Let me get those." She was already kneeling before the woman could answer, gathering oranges from beneath chairs and strangers' shoes, pressing them gently back into what remained of the torn bags. The elderly woman looked down at her with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Not gratitude. Something older than gratitude. Something that looked almost like relief. "You'll ruin your apron, child," the woman said softly. Elena glanced down at the flour dusting her front and laughed under her breath. "This apron has survived a split espresso machine, a toddler's birthday cake, and one very dramatic soup incident. A few groceries won't finish it." The woman's lips curved. Just slightly, just enough. Elena gathered the last orange from beneath a bar stool and straightened up. She was 28, tired in the way that lives in your bones rather than your eyes. With dark hair twisted into a messy bun that had been neat 6 hours ago, her apron carried the honest stains of a long morning shift. Her shoes were the practical, ugly kind that didn't hurt by the end of the day. A small mercy she had learned to be grateful for. She worked the early shift at Lumiere Cafe. Sometimes the lunch rush too. Sometimes she stayed after closing because her manager, Garrett, found reasons to schedule her for the tasks nobody else wanted, and she was too careful with her situation to refuse. Rent in Silverbrook had gone up twice in the past year. All of her school shoes needed replacing. The car she no longer owned had been sold 8 months ago when the repair estimate came back higher than her monthly salary. Being stretched thin, Elena had learned, was not a single emergency. It was simply the texture of every ordinary day. "Where are you heading?" Elena asked, adjusting the torn bags so the weight settled more evenly. "The black carriage." The woman tilted her head toward the window, just outside. Elena followed her gaze and felt something shift quietly in her chest. Parked directly across the street was a long, ink-black vehicle. Not quite a car, not quite anything Elena had seen before, gleaming under the gray afternoon sky as though it didn't belong in Silverbrook at all. Beside it stood 2 figures in dark armor, not security uniforms. Armor. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were simply watching the cafe entrance with the absolute unblinking stillness of men who had learned patience across a very long time. Elena looked back at the elderly woman. "I'll carry them out," she said. The woman studied her face the way people do when they are deciding whether to trust something they weren't expecting to find. "You don't know me." "No," Elena agreed, "but you needed help." Something shifted in the elderly woman's expression at that. Something quiet and private, like a door opening in a room that had been sealed for a long time. Together they moved toward the entrance. One of the armored figures stepped forward instantly the moment the door opened, alarm crossing his face before he smoothed it away. The elderly woman raised one hand and he stopped immediately. "She helped me, Varric," the woman said. "Stand down." The man looked at Elena the way people look at things that don't belong in a particular picture. Elena held up the grocery bag slightly. "Just oranges," she said. "I promise." The elderly woman laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised, as though she had not expected to do that. Elena set the bags carefully inside the vehicle and stepped back. The woman immediately reached for her cloak pocket. "Please don't," Elena said quickly. The woman paused. "I insist. I didn't do it for anything." Elena softened her voice, aware she had spoken too sharply. "I mean, truly, it's all right." The elderly woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Elena's hand between both of hers. Her fingers were extraordinarily cold. Elena noticed that. She noticed, too, that the woman's eyes, dark a moment ago, seemed to carry a faint, deep crimson in the afternoon light, like candlelight viewed through dark wine. Elena decided her mind was playing tricks on her. "What is your name?" the woman asked. "Elena. Elena," she repeated, as if placing it carefully somewhere she would not forget it. "Do they treat you well? The people in that cafe?" Elena glanced back through the window. Garrett was standing beside the espresso machine with his arms crossed and the particular expression he reserved for when she cost him time. "Well enough," she said. The woman's eyes sharpened. "That means no." Elena looked at the street. "It means I need the job." The elderly woman squeezed her hand once, gently. "Thank you, Elena Ashford." Elena hadn't given her last name. She didn't notice that until she was already back inside. Garrett was waiting beside the counter with a face that made the cafe feel smaller. "Do you think I run a charity?" He kept his voice low, which was always worse than when he raised it. "You walked off the floor during the lunch prep window. An elderly woman dropped her groceries. And somehow that required you personally." He leaned close enough that Elena could smell burnt coffee on his collar. "You need this job, Ashford. Act like it." Elena tied her apron tighter and said nothing. She had become very practiced at saying nothing, at absorbing the particular weight of words that weren't quite cruel enough to push back against, just heavy enough to carry home. The rest of the afternoon moved in its usual rhythm. Flat white, thank you. Almond croissant, of course. 2 Americanos. Sorry for the wait. Smile. Turn. Apologize. Smile again. By closing, her feet ached steadily, and Garrett had found a way to dock 20 minutes from her timesheet. She walked home through Silverbrook's early evening, past the bakery where the owner sometimes left yesterday's bread on the step for people who needed it. She picked up a small loaf without stopping, past the park where Oliver had asked her last week whether their neighbor's dog could be his dog too. And she had said maybe someday in the voice she used when the honest answer was probably not. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building above a dry cleaner's. The pipes knocked in the cold. The hallway light needed a new bulb she kept forgetting to buy. But inside it was warm, and Oliver had left his shoes in the exact center of the doormat in the particular way that meant he had been trying to be tidy and gotten distracted before finishing. She found him asleep on the sofa with a library book open on his chest. She carried him to bed. She kissed his forehead. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him the way parents do when they need to remember exactly why everything is worth it. Back in the kitchen, she set the bread on the counter. She thought, briefly, about the elderly woman's cold hands, about the armored men who had waited without speaking, about the way the woman had said her full name at the end. Elena Ashford, with a certainty she hadn't earned from a single conversation. She decided it was nothing. A strange afternoon. Nothing more. She had absolutely no idea that somewhere beneath the cursed mountains of Ravenmore Vale, in a throne room lit by eternal black flame, an elegant woman in a gold-embroidered cloak was sitting across from her son and saying quietly, "Find her. The woman is called Elena Ashford. Bring her to me before morning." Elena just helped a stranger that everyone else was too afraid to touch. And by morning, 4 armored guards will come looking for her. If you want to know what happens next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part. And tell me in the comments, would you have helped that elderly woman, or would you have walked away like everyone else? The morning after felt deliberately ordinary, as mornings sometimes do when something underneath them has already changed. Elena arrived at Lumiere Café 12 minutes before her shift, which was her habit. She tied her apron in the back hallway, filled the first coffee order before the machine had fully finished warming, and told herself firmly that yesterday had been nothing. A strange elderly woman, a cold hand, a name spoken with unusual certainty. These things happened. People were strange. Silverbrook was a small town, and small towns occasionally produced inexplicable afternoons. She had left Oliver with Mrs. Collum, Havel next door, who watched him on early mornings in exchange for Elena's help with grocery runs on Thursdays. Oliver had still been half asleep, his hair flattened on one side, shoes on the wrong feet. She had switched them while he stood yawning and kissed the top of his head and walked out into the gray morning, telling herself everything was fine. By 8 o'clock, the cafe was full. The breakfast rush carried its usual texture, flat whites and impatient silences. The clatter of plates from the kitchen, Garrett circling the floor with his clipboard looking for small corrections to make. Elena moved through it the way she always did, efficiently, quietly, without drawing attention to herself. She restocked the pastry display. She remembered without being told that the elderly gentleman in the corner always wanted his Americano with room for cream, even when he didn't ask for it. She smiled at the right moments and said sorry at the right moments and kept her head down. She was steaming milk behind the counter when the door opened. The cafe didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet in a wave, table by table, the way sound drains from a room when something enters that doesn't belong there. Elena heard it before she looked up, the drop in conversation, the scrape of a chair, the particular silence of a room full of people collectively holding their breath. 4 men stood just inside the entrance. They were not dressed for Silverbrook. They were not dressed anywhere ordinary. The first, the largest, who positioned himself near the door as though securing it, wore black armor layered in dark iron, a deep crimson cloak clasped at the shoulder with a crest Elena didn't recognize. His jaw was set like something carved rather than grown. His eyes moved across the room with the unhurried precision of a man cataloging threats as a matter of routine. Kaler Vane. Elena would learn his name later. Right now, he was simply the one who made the room feel smaller. The second had taken the window position. Deliberately, she realized, the way soldiers take positions, leaner than the first, with close-cropped dark hair and the expression of someone who found most things mildly disappointing. Draven Thorn. His hand rested at his side, near something buckled to his belt that Elena chose not to look at directly. The third was younger-looking, pale in the particular way that suggested it wasn't a complexion but a condition, with sharp features that might have been handsome if they'd been arranged by someone interested in approachability. Cassian Dusk. He was watching the kitchen door. The fourth walked to the counter. He was not the tallest, but he was the one the room arranged itself around. Mallorik Voss. His armor was slightly different from the others. Older-looking, more worn in a way that suggested experience rather than neglect. His eyes were dark and completely level, and he looked at Elena with the measured focus of a man who had been given a description and was now confirming it. Garrett appeared from nowhere, straightening his collar, voice pitched 3 notes higher than usual. "Gentlemen, welcome. What can I get started for? We are here for Elena Ashford." The milk pitcher slipped in Elena's hand. She caught it. At the corner table, she heard someone whisper, "Did she steal something?" And from closer, "Is she being arrested?" Garrett turned slowly. His expression had gone the particular color of a man calculating how this affected him. Elena. His voice was careful. Her mind was already somewhere else entirely. Oliver. Had something happened to Oliver? Had Mrs. Havel called someone? Was it the elderly woman? Had she been hurt after she left? Had Elena somehow, "That's me. That's me." She stepped forward before she fully decided to. Mallorik Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he reached inside his cloak and produced an envelope. Black. sealed in dark wax pressed with a crest she had never seen, twin serpents curling around a crown, a single crimson stone set at its center. Her name was written on the front in ink that looked almost too dark to be ordinary ink. She opened it. Miss Elena Ashford, Queen Mother Evelise Knight Bane of Noctis Dominion, requests your presence at your earliest convenience. A carriage has been provided. Your journey will be safe. Your return is entirely your choice. There was no explanation, no elaboration, just the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who had never needed to explain themselves. We cannot compel you, Malric said, but we were asked to wait. Elena looked up. I need to arrange care for my son first. Something moved across his expression that wasn't quite surprising. Of course, he said. We'll wait. Behind her, she heard Garrett make a sound she had never heard from him before. She thought it might be the absence of an argument he couldn't find. 20 minutes later, Oliver safely delivered back to Mrs. Havel with a kiss and a promise she hoped she could keep. Elena stepped into the black carriage. The 4 guards took positions around it without a word exchanged between them. Silverbrook fell away behind her. The road curved north. The mountains of Ravenmoor Vale rose slowly out of the morning mist, ancient and dark and patient, and the carriage carried her toward them, and the mist rose to meet her, and the world she knew disappeared. Nobody spoke during the journey. Elena had expected that to feel threatening. Instead, it settled into something almost meditative. The steady rhythm of the carriage, the gradual darkening of the sky as the road climbed. The way Silverbrook's familiar sounds faded completely until the only thing left was the wind off the mountains and the creak of wheels on old stone. She watched through the narrow window as the landscape changed. The fields gave way to forest. The forest thickened and darkened, trees pressing closer to the road until their branches met overhead and filtered the morning light into something thin and gray. Then the trees ended entirely and the road became a path, and the path became a tunnel cut directly into the mountain face, wide enough for the carriage lined with iron torches burning alow. Sourceless blue that cast no shadows in the way ordinary fire does. Elena pressed her fingers together in her lap and said nothing. The tunnel went on for longer than she could measure. The blue light never changed. The guards outside were silent. She thought about Oliver asking Mrs. Havel for a second bowl of cereal and whether Mrs. Havel would remember that he didn't like the milk too cold. She thought about small, manageable things, because the alternative was thinking about where she was going, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Then the tunnel ended, and Elena stopped breathing. Noctis Dominion opened beneath her, like a city dreamed by someone who had never seen daylight and hadn't missed it. It spread across the base of an enormous underground valley, cathedral spires of black stone rising toward a ceiling of living rock so high it might as well have been sky, threaded through with veins of deep violet crystal that cast their own permanent twilight across everything below. Streets of dark cobblestone wound between towers and archways and bridges suspended over channels of black water that caught the crystal light and held it. Thousands of structures, each one older than anything Elena had ever stood beside. Banners hung between the spires, black, edged in crimson, bearing that same crest from the wax seal. It was terrifying. It was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. The carriage descended a wide road that curved along the valley wall, and the city rose to meet them. And by the time they passed through the first gate, Elena's hands had stopped shaking, simply because she had run out of the particular energy that shaking requires. The palace was at the city's center. It was not the largest structure, but it was the one everything else seemed to organize itself around. The way objects in a room arranged themselves relative to their most important piece. Dark stone, high, narrow windows lit from within in deep amber, an entrance flanked by statues she didn't look at long enough to describe. Inside smelled of old wood and something cold and clean, like air from very deep underground. Malric Foss led her through corridors that were neither welcoming nor hostile. simply ancient, in the way that certain places are ancient, worn smooth by centuries of the same footsteps. Tapestries on the walls depicted scenes Elena couldn't interpret quickly enough as she passed them. Figures in armor, skies with no sun, a woman with silver hair and a crown, standing at the edge of something vast. She was shown into a hall and left standing. The hall was large and mostly dark, and at its far end, on a throne that looked less like furniture and more like geological formation, black stone shaped by intention rather than craft, sat a man Elena felt before she fully saw him. He stood as she entered. He was tall, pale with the absolute pallor of something that had never needed sunlight, with white hair that fell to his shoulders and caught the amber torchlight without warming it. He wore dark armor edged in gold, a deep crimson cape falling from his shoulders, and his eyes, the last thing she found the courage to look at, were red. Not the faint crimson she had glimpsed in his mother's gaze. Full, deep, luminous red, the color of garnets held to a flame, watching her with an intelligence so focused she felt it like pressure. This was King Lucian Nightbane. Elena's mind, entirely against her will, produced the thought, I helped his mother pick up groceries. She straightened her spine. She kept her hands still. She had spent 3 years surviving things that frightened her. She could survive being looked at. Then he said, "Thank you." She had prepared for many things during the carriage ride. An accusation, a test, some elaborate formal proceeding she would fail to understand. She had not prepared for 2 quiet words delivered without performance or preamble. She stopped. "You're welcome," she said. Because she had been raised to respond to gratitude and her instincts were apparently more reliable than her reasoning. A sound from the side of the hall. Elena turned. Queen Mother Evelis was seated near a low fire in a high-backed chair, still wrapped in her black embroidered cloak, watching Elena with an expression she recognized from yesterday, that same quiet, private look, like a hypothesis being confirmed. "Elena Ashford," Evelis said warmly. "You look exactly as I expected you to look, slightly bewildered and entirely composed." "I'm more bewildered than I appear," Elena said honestly. Evelis smiled. "Sit down, child. I owe you an explanation." She had not, it turned out, been a lost elderly woman struggling with her groceries. Or rather, she had been, deliberately. Queen Mother Evelis Nightbane had slipped away from her guards and traveled into Silverbrook on foot, in plain clothes, carrying bags she deliberately overfilled, to answer a question that had occupied her for some time, whether kindness still existed in the human world. Not performing kindness, not calculated kindness, the instinctive, unconditional kind, the kind that moves before the mind can attach a price to it. "You were not the only person I tested," Evelis said. "You were the only person who helped." Elena thought about the businessman's shoe and the orange rolling into the gutter. I'm sorry. That's not. It is what it is," Evelis said. "And you are what you are." A silence settled. Lucian had not sat back down. He stood to the side of the throne now, watching Elena with an expression that wasn't quite readable. Not warm, not cold, but attentive in a way that felt significant. "We would like to offer you something," he said. His voice was low and even, and carried across the hall without effort. "A home, staffed and maintained wherever in Silverbrook you choose. A monthly sum that would remove every financial concern you currently carry. Servants, and full educational sponsorship for your son. Whatever he wants to learn, wherever he wishes to go." Elena was quiet. The court around her, and she realized only now that there were people standing in the shadows of the hall watching, seemed collectively to lean forward. "No," she said. The word landed in the silence like a stone into still water. Somewhere in the shadows, she heard a sharp intake of breath. Lucian's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted, a fraction of movement in the careful stillness of his face. "No," he repeated, not challenging, almost curious. You don't owe me anything, Elena said. I helped someone who needed help. That's just what you do. I don't want a reward for it. She paused. I only want to get back before Oliver comes home from school and finds me gone. He worries. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Evelise was looking at her son with an expression Elena couldn't read. Lucien was looking at Elena with one she wasn't sure had a name. I will have Malric arrange your return, he said after a moment. Whenever you're ready. Thank you. She hesitated. For the explanation. I've been trying to decide whether yesterday was real. It was real, Lucien said. I know. I just needed to hear it from someone with a throne. Evelise laughed, that same warm, surprised sound from the cafe doorway. Even a few of the shadows around the hall's edge seemed to relax. Lucien did not laugh, but something around his eyes changed, briefly, in a way that suggested he remembered how. Elena was escorted back through the amber corridors toward the carriage. Behind her, in the throne room, Evelise remained beside the low fire. After a long moment, she spoke quietly to her son. She reminds me, Evelise said, of the woman your father once hoped humans could become. Lucien said nothing. He stood looking at the doorway Elena had walked through, and the hall was very quiet and the torches burned their steady amber, and he stood there considerably longer than he needed to. The first invitation arrived 3 days after Elena returned to Silverbrook. A small envelope, black sealed with the Nightbane crest, delivered to Lumiere Café by a single guard who waited for her acknowledgement with the patient stillness of someone entirely comfortable standing motionless for extended periods. Inside, in Evelise's handwriting, elegant, precise, slightly old-fashioned in its letter forms, was a simple request. Come for tea if you're willing. Bring the boy if he'd like. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it, tucked it into her apron pocket, finished her shift, picked up Oliver from Mrs. Havel's, and asked him on the walk home whether he'd like to visit somewhere unusual that weekend. Oliver asked if there would be snacks. She told him probably yes. Then I'd like, he said, with a decisive simplicity of 6-year-olds, and that was the end of the deliberation. They visited on a Saturday. Oliver held Elena's hand through the blue-lit tunnel and was quiet for approximately 40 seconds before beginning to ask questions that she had no answers to. Delivered in the rapid-fire sequence she recognized as his particular form of wonder. Why was the light blue? What was the crystal in the ceiling made of? Were there fish in the black water? Were vampires allergic to garlic? Or was that made up? Did the king sleep in a coffin or a regular bed because coffins seemed uncomfortable? Elena told him she genuinely didn't know and suggested he ask someone with more information. He did immediately, upon being shown into Evelise's private sitting room, a warmer space than Elena had expected, lined with dark bookshelves and lit by dozens of small candles, smelling of something close to bergamot. Evelise was seated near the window when they entered. She looked at Oliver with the particular arrested expression of someone encountering something they had forgotten could exist. Oliver looked at her with frank, unguarded assessment. Your eyes are red, he said. They are, Evelise agreed. Elena's are brown. I've noticed. Mine are brown too. He considered this. Did it hurt, having red ones? Evelise was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, I honestly don't remember. It was a very long time ago. Oliver accepted this with a nod, as though long ago explained most things adequately, and asked if she had any books about dragons. She had 4. He chose 2. He spent the next hour on the floor beside her chair reading with his back against her knee, while she drank tea and occasionally pointed out an illustration she thought he might find interesting. And Elena sat across from them holding her cup and feeling something quiet and complicated move through her chest. The particular ache of watching someone you love receive something you couldn't have given them yourself. Evelise laughed 3 times that afternoon. Real laughter, unguarded, slightly rusty at the edges from disuse. Once when Oliver announced that a dragon in the illustration looked like Garrett from the cafe, he has the same face. And once when he fell asleep mid-sentence still holding the book. And once at something Elena said that she hadn't intended to be funny, but apparently was. After Oliver was settled on a cushioned bench with a blanket someone had produced without being asked, Evelis looked at Elena with calm, clear eyes and said, "You've done well by him." Elena wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've done what I could." "That's the same thing," Evelis said. "More people don't understand that than should." Lucian appeared on the third visit, not announced, not formally. He was simply present in the corridor when Elena and Oliver arrived, speaking quietly with Malric Foss about something that concluded as they approached. He looked at Oliver with a momentary uncertainty Elena found unexpectedly humanizing, as though children were a phenomenon he understood theoretically but hadn't prepared for. Oliver looked up at him. "You're very tall," he said. "I've been told," Lucian said. "Are you the king?" "I am." Oliver thought about this. "Do you have a dragon?" A pause. "No." "You should get one," Oliver said with genuine advisory concern and walked past him into Evelis's sitting room. Lucian watched him go. Then he looked at Elena. Something in his expression was different from the throne room, less formal, as though the context had shifted something. "He's forthright," he said. "He gets it from somewhere," Elena said, and walked in after her son. She didn't look back to see whether Lucian smiled, but she heard him follow. Over the weeks that followed, their conversations began the way most real conversations do, sideways, without intention, in the margins of other things. He would be present when she visited and they would speak about nothing significant and then, gradually, about things that were. He asked about Silverbrook. She answered without embellishment. He spoke about governance and she responded with the practical perspective of someone who had lived inside the consequences of decisions made by people with power, which he listened to with the attentiveness of someone unaccustomed to that particular angle. She never flattered him. She didn't modify her opinions to fit his rank. When she disagreed, she said so in the straightforward way she said everything, not provocatively but without apology. Once she told him that a policy he described regarding human settlements near Ravenmore Vale sounded, in practical terms, like it had been designed by someone who had never needed to worry about where next month's rent came from. He was quiet for a long moment after that. Then he said, "You may be right. She didn't make anything of it." She moved the conversation forward, but something in the careful architecture of his expression had shifted, and she noticed, and she thought he knew she noticed, and neither of them addressed it directly. Not everyone found this unremarkable. The court of Noctis Dominion had existed in its present form for longer than most human civilizations, and in that time it had developed the particular culture of closed systems, deeply hierarchical, acutely sensitive to precedent, and profoundly suspicious of anything that arrived from outside it without proper category. Elena Ashford had no proper category. She was not a diplomat, not a supplicant, not a prisoner, or a servant or a consort, or a political instrument. She was a cafe worker from a small riverside town who had helped an elderly woman with her groceries and had subsequently, inexplicably, been welcomed back repeatedly by the Queen Mother and engaged in genuine conversation by the king. The nobles of the inner court watched this with the careful attention of people calculating implications. Some found it merely baffling, a curiosity, harmless, presumably temporary. Others found it deeply troubling. In a long gallery off the eastern corridor, 3 evenings after Elena's 4th visit, 2 figures in court dress stood near a window that looked down onto the palace entrance. Below, Elena was being escorted to her carriage by Cassian Dusk, Oliver asleep against her shoulder, her breath misting faintly in the underground cold. "He watched her for 40 minutes this afternoon," one said. "During the Eastern Council briefing, he was present in body only." The second figure was quiet, watching the carriage below. "She refuses every gift," they said. "Every reward. She asks for nothing, which makes her more dangerous than if she asked for everything." The carriage moved through the palace gates. Elena didn't look up. She had no reason to. The two figures watched until the lights of the carriage disappeared into the dark streets of Noctis Dominion, and then they turned from the window and their conversation continued in voices too low for the corridor torches to illuminate. The rumors reached Silverbrook before Elena did, most mornings. She first noticed it 3 weeks after her 4th visit. A folded newspaper left on the counter at Lumiere Café, open to a small column on page 7 beneath the heading Strange Sightings near Ravenmoor Vale, local woman linked to mountain disappearances. The article was short and inaccurate in almost every particular. It described Elena as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. It quoted an unnamed source describing armored figures entering the cafe. It used the phrase possible cult activity in a way that suggested the journalist had prioritized atmosphere over verification. Garrett read it before she arrived and had printed 2 additional copies by the time she tied her apron. Cult activity, he said, setting one on the counter in front of her. It's not accurate, Elena said. Are you going to tell me what is accurate? She picked up the newspaper, folded it closed, and placed it under the counter. No, she said pleasantly, and went to start the espresso machine. The article was not the last. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 more appeared in various regional papers, each slightly more embellished than the previous. Silverbrook waitress vanishes repeatedly into Ravenmoor Mountains. A blogger posted photographs of the black carriage taken from across the street, blurred, dramatic, entirely without context. Someone on the internet suggested she was a government operative. Someone else suggested something considerably stranger. Elena read none of it after the first article. She had learned early in her adult life that paying attention to narratives you couldn't control was simply a way of borrowing other people's anxiety, and she had enough of her own to manage. What she could not as easily ignore was the shift inside Noctis Dominion itself. She felt it on her 5th visit. Something tighter in the corridors, a formality among the palace staff that hadn't been there before. Guards who had begun to nod in recognition now kept their eyes forward. Conversations in antechambers stopped as she passed rather than continuing at lowered volume as they used to. Even Cassian Dusk, who had developed the habit of pointing out architectural details during her escort through the palace as though conducting an unofficial tour, was quiet. She mentioned it to nobody. She filed it carefully in the part of her mind she used for things that needed watching. She overheard them on a Wednesday. She had arrived slightly early for tea with Evelise and had been shown to a small waiting room off the main corridor. A narrow, book-lined space with a bench and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard. The door had been left partially open. She had been sitting quietly for perhaps 4 minutes when 2 servants passed in the corridor outside, speaking in low, rapid voices in the particular register of people who believed themselves unobserved. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply went still, the way people do when sound suddenly carries meaning. The ceremonial wine, the Valethorn vintage, the one always presented to the Queen Mother at the opening toast, switched during preparation. 3rd barrel from the left in the lower cellar, Heron confirmed it himself. The banquet is in 4 days. After the toast, it moves too fast for. Then they were past the doorway, and the corridor swallowed their voices. Elena sat very still for a long moment. She thought about what she had heard. She arranged it in order, not the emotional order which wanted to move immediately toward alarm, but the practical order. What she knew, what she'd inferred, what the gaps were. She was not a person who panicked usefully, so she didn't permit herself to panic. She went to tea. She sat with Evelise and Oliver and drank her cup and spoke normally and watched the Queen Mother's face. The ease of it, the warmth directed at Oliver, the absolute absence of any awareness that something was being prepared for her, and felt the knowledge settle into her chest like cold water. She needed to tell Lucien. She found him in the Eastern study after Evelise had taken Oliver to see the library's illustrated astronomy collection. Malric Foss was outside the door and let her pass with the measured consideration he applied to most things. Lucien was standing at the window, the manufactured kind, fitted with crystals that approximated daylight. reading correspondence. He turned when she entered, registered her expression, and set the papers down. She told him what she'd heard, exactly, without embellishment, in the order she'd heard it. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You heard two servants speaking in a corridor," Lucien said. "Yes. You don't know their names. You can't identify them. You heard partial sentences." "I know what I heard." He was quiet for a moment. His expression was not dismissive. She would have found that easier to navigate. It was the expression of someone holding two possibilities simultaneously and finding both uncomfortable. "Elena, the Veilthorn cellar is secured. The ceremonial wine preparation is handled by staff who have served this house for decades. What you're describing would require—" "I know what it would require," she said. "I'm telling you what I heard. There is no evidence." "There wasn't evidence until I told you. That's not the same as there being nothing." Lucien held her gaze. She held his. Neither of them moved. From across the palace, she heard Oliver's distant laugh, bright, unguarded, carrying through the stone corridors with the particular ease of a child completely at home somewhere he had no reason to feel at home. It made the moment feel more urgent, not less. "I'm asking you to check," Elena said. "That's all. Check the cellar. Check the barrel." Before the banquet, Lucien said nothing for a long moment. "Then I'll look into it." It wasn't enough. She could see from his face that political calculation was moving behind the commitment, the careful weight of acting on a human woman's unverified account against the court's already strained perception of her influence. She understood the hesitation. She didn't forgive it. "Thank you," she said, and left. 4 days later, the banquet hall of Noctis Dominion filled with candlelight and the assembled nobility of the vampire court in their formal dark splendor. Evla sat at the head table in silver and black, composed and gracious, entirely unaware. The ceremonial goblets were already in place. Elena stood near the entrance in the plain dress she had borrowed from the palace's guest wardrobe. Too formal for Silverbrook, too simple for the court. Exactly wrong for every context, and watched the servants move between the tables and thought about what Lucien had or hadn't done and waited. At the far end of the hall, the sommelier lifted the Veilthorn vintage. The opening toast was 30 seconds away. Elena warned him. Lucien hesitated. And now the poisoned goblet is already on the table, 30 seconds from the Queen Mother's lips. Hit the like button if you think Elena's warning came just in time, and comment below. Do you think Lucien actually checked that cellar, or did he let politics get in the way? Subscribe right now because the next chapter changes everything. She saw it happen in the space of 4 seconds. A servant she didn't recognize, moving with slightly too much purpose, slightly too precisely timed, crossed behind the head table during a momentary shift in attention, as a nobleman rose to greet someone across the room. The movement was small, practiced. A quarter turn of the wrist, one goblet exchanged for another from beneath a covered tray, the original disappearing into a folded cloth before the tray was set down. Nobody else was looking at the servant. Everyone else was looking at each other. Elena was already moving before she had fully decided to. She crossed the hall in the silence between one moment and the next, weaving between chairs and the long dark coats of court nobility who turned to watch her passage with the offended confusion of people unused to being navigated around. She reached the head table and put her hand on Evelise's arm. "Don't drink from that goblet," she said quietly. "Please, right now, please don't." Evelise looked at her. Read her face. Set the goblet down without a word. Lucien was on his feet before Elena could turn to find him. He had been watching her cross the room. She understood that in retrospect, and whatever he saw in her movement had answered the question he'd been holding for 4 days. He crossed to the head table in 3 steps, lifted the goblet himself, and looked at the deep ruby liquid inside with the focused attention of someone whose senses operated beyond the ordinary range of human perception. His expression didn't change, but he set the goblet down with a controlled precision that was more frightening than if he'd thrown it. Then he overturned the entire table. The crash of it silenced the hall absolutely. Crystal and silver and the veil-thorn vintage spreading across the stone floor like a dark stain, and every person in the room frozen in the sudden ringing quiet. And Lucian standing in the wreckage of the head table looking across the hall with red eyes that had gone very, very bright. "Find him," he said, quietly, to no one in particular, to everyone. The servant was already running. He made it 4 steps into the corridor before Kaylor Vane came through the side entrance at a speed that didn't belong to anything that needed to breathe, and the servant hit the ground and didn't get up. And Kaylor stood over him with one hand on the collar of his coat and looked back into the hall with an expression that said the situation was contained and also that he found it personally offensive. What happened next was not contained. 3 nobles at the far end of the hall rose simultaneously. The movement coordinated, rehearsed, the specific synchronicity of people who had planned for the moment the plan failed. One produced a blade that caught the candlelight in a way that suggested it had been designed for exactly this kind of room. The second moved toward the head table. The third reached the door nearest the kitchen and held it, and through it came 4 more figures in the dark armor of palace guards, who were not palace guards. Draven Thorn went through the window partition to the left of the hall in a movement so fast Elena's eyes registered only the result. Glass and leading, and a figure in false armor who had been standing one moment and was on the floor the next. Draven crouched beside him with the economy of motion of someone for whom violence was a precise instrument rather than an emotional one. Cassian Dusk was already at the second noble's throat, redirecting the blade with one hand while the other connected with a force that sent the man across 2 tables and into the far wall, where he remained. Malrit Voss put himself between Elena and the door and didn't move from that position regardless of what was happening around him. A decision she understood only later had been a standing order. Elena wasn't watching any of them. She had both arms around Evelise, pulling her back from the head table toward the alcove behind a throne. Dace, the Queen Mother, moving with her without resistance, her composure intact in the way of someone who had survived enough centuries to recognize the difference between chaos and genuine threat, and was currently treating this as the latter. They pressed into the alcove. Elena put herself in front. She had nothing to fight with. She stayed there anyway. Lucian moved through the hall the way the storm moves through a landscape, not fast exactly, but inevitable, with the particular force of something that has been patient for a very long time and no longer needs to be. The conspirators who faced him directly lasted seconds. Those who tried to reach the exits found Kaylor had secured them. The entire thing was over in less time than it takes to describe. The hall fell quiet again, a different quiet from before. Lucian stood in the center of it, breathing steadily, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that had been building in his own court under his own roof, and his expression was not angry. It was something colder than anger. The face of someone recalculating every conversation of the past several months against new information. He turned. Elena stepped out of the alcove. Evelise's hand was on her shoulder. Steady, warm, deliberate. Lucian crossed the hall in silence. He stopped in front of Elena and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had shed every layer of the careful, centuries-practiced composure she had come to recognize as his default. What was underneath, it was not what she expected. "You were standing in front of her," he said. His voice was very low. "With nothing. You stood in front of her with nothing. There wasn't time to find anything," Elena said. "Elena," he stopped. Something moved across his face, a fracture in the controlled surface of it, brief and unmistakable. "I almost didn't check the cellar. I checked it this morning, 4 hours ago." He paused. "If you hadn't come to me when you did." "But I did," she said. "You could have been killed tonight." "So could she." Elena glanced at Evelise, then back at him. "So, I didn't think about it." Lucian was quiet for a long time. Around them, the hall was filling again with movement, Guards, court officials, the organized response of a palace managing its own emergency. But in the small radius of the two of them, it was still, "I have ruled for 4 centuries," he said finally, "by trusting nothing I couldn't verify and no one I couldn't afford to lose." He stopped. "I find that position increasingly difficult to maintain." Elena looked at him steadily. "That sounds exhausting," she said. Something crossed his face that, in better lighting, in a less destroyed banquet hall, might have been the beginning of a smile. Behind them, Evelise straightened her cloak, assessed the wreckage of her banquet with the serene practicality of someone who had attended worse evenings, and said to no one in particular, "I suppose we'll have to reschedule the toast." The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after they have been very loud. The conspirators were identified, tried, and dealt with according to laws older than most human nations. Efficiently, without theater, in the manner of a kingdom that had long experience managing internal betrayal and had developed clean systems for it. 11 nobles in total, 3 senior court officials, the servant who had switched the goblets who turned out to have been coerced rather than willing and was treated accordingly. Lucian presided over each proceeding himself. He did not delegate it. Elena understood without being told that this was deliberate, that he was making a point to his court not only about consequences but about attention, about the quality of it, about what happened when a king had been watching the wrong things. The court settled. Not immediately and not without friction, but with the gradual certainty of a structure that had found its balance again after being tested. Elena went back to Lumiere Café and worked her shifts and made coffee and told nobody anything, which was becoming a practiced skill. Lucian came to Silverbrook on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, without ceremony, with only Malric Vos at a discreet distance behind him. He walked into the café in a long dark coat that was almost ordinary, and sat at the corner table. And Elena brought him a coffee without being asked because she had learned by now how he took it, and he looked at the room for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at things he was deciding about. "I'd like to propose something," he said. She sat down across from him. Garrett was watching from the kitchen doorway. She didn't look over. Lucian laid it out with the directness she had come to expect from him. No preamble, no flattery, no softening of edges. Silverbrook would become the first formally recognized diplomatic settlement between Nauti's dominion and the human world. A quiet alliance, conducted without public declaration for now, built on practical cooperation rather than announced politics. Safe passage. Shared resources were useful. A framework that could expand carefully over time, and Lumiere Café, under royal protection, its staff compensated generously. Its premises expanded if Elena chose, would become the designated meeting point. Neutral ground, the first place in centuries where someone from Noctis Dominion could sit across from a human being in ordinary daylight without it being an act of war or a secret. "Not charity," he said before she could speak. "I want to be clear about that. This is not a reward. It's a function that requires exactly the person you already are. I'm not inventing a role to benefit you. I'm asking you to formally occupy one you've been filling informally since the first day you walked into that hall." Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, a Silverbrook morning moved past the cafe windows in its usual rhythm. A woman with a pushchair, 2 schoolchildren arguing about something, the baker from 3 doors down sweeping his step. "Oliver stays in school here," she said. "His life doesn't change without his say." "Agreed. I keep running this place the way I run it. No court involvement in daily decisions." "Agreed. And I can tell you when something isn't working." "I'm counting on it," Lucian said. And something in the way he said it, dry, certain, and entirely sincere, made her believe him completely. She said yes. The formal arrangement came with one addition she hadn't expected. Evelise had taken it upon herself, with the particular determination of someone who had decided a thing and found opposition theoretically interesting but practically irrelevant, to sponsor Oliver's education personally. Not a fund, not an institution, a direct, ongoing involvement. She sent books before the ink was dry on any agreement. She wrote Oliver letters in her precise, old-fashioned hand that he read very seriously and responded to in the large, careful printing of someone who understood the correspondence was important. She asked about his teachers. She remembered the names of his friends. She sent on his 7th birthday a brass telescope that made him go completely silent for 30 seconds, the longest Elena had ever seen him still, before he turned and asked if he could write to thank her immediately. He had never had grandparents. He didn't use the word. He didn't need to. 2 weeks before the cafe reopened under its new arrangement, Lucien asked Elena to walk with him through the palace gardens, a long, strange, beautiful space of dark flowers and sculpted stone that somehow caught the light of the crystal ceiling and held it warmly. They walked without particular direction and spoke about small things and eventually didn't speak at all, which had become one of the more comfortable silences Elena had experienced with another person. He stopped near the garden's far wall. He reached into his coat and produced a key. It was old, unmistakably, profoundly old, silver gone dark at the edges with centuries of handling, simply made, lighter than it looked. He held it out. "This key opens the hidden gate between Silverbrook and Noctis Dominion," he said. "The direct passage, the one that bypasses the main tunnel entirely." He paused. "Every ruler gives treasures. Few give trust. This key belongs only to my family. Today I place it in your hands." Elena looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it. It was warm. She hadn't expected that. "I'll take care of it," she said. "I know," he said, simply without qualification, in the tone of a man for whom the statement required no elaboration because it was just the truth. The morning Lumiere Café reopened. Sunlight came through the tall windows and fell across every table in long, warm bars the way it always had, and the coffee machine made its familiar sounds, and the pastry display was full. And the small brass bell above the door rang steadily as people came in from the Silverbrook morning. Oliver was at the corner table with Evelise, working through a stack of almond croissants with the systematic dedication he brought to things he enjoyed, explaining something about his astronomy book that she was listening to with complete attention. He made her laugh twice before the first hour was finished. She looked, Elena thought, like someone who had finally put down something very heavy and discovered that her hands still worked. Outside, at careful intervals along the front of the cafe, 4 figures stood in the morning light. Their dark armor caught the sun differently than it caught the underground crystal glow of Noctis Dominion. Warmer, less severe. Kaelor Vane near the door. Draven Thorn at the corner. Cassian Dusk watching the street with the mildly analytical expression he brought to most things. Malric Voss to the right, steady and unhurried as a landmark. They were not this morning frightening. They were just there, watchful, reliable, present. The way good things are present, without requiring acknowledgement. The bell above the door rang again. Lucien came in without ceremony, without announcement, in the long, dark coat he wore when he wasn't being a king. He looked around the room once, taking in Evelise and Oliver, the humans and the 2 Noctis Dominion officials seated carefully at separate tables. The ordinary morning arranging itself into something that had never existed before, and something in his expression settled quietly into a kind of peace that Elena suspected was relatively new to it. He came to the counter. Elena was already pouring. She set the cup in front of him without a word, and he looked at it and then at her, and the cafe moved around them with its warm and ordinary sounds, and outside Silverbrook went about its morning. And somewhere beneath the mountains, Noctis Dominion waited in its ancient, patient dark. She thought about an afternoon several months ago, a torn grocery bag, oranges rolling across a polished floor, a room full of people looking the other way. One small choice. One unremarkable act of basic human decency performed without calculation or expectation in an ordinary cafe on an ordinary afternoon. She picked up the coffee pot and went to check on the next table. Behind her, for the first time in 4 centuries, the vampire king of Noctis Dominion sat in a sunlit room among human beings and drank his coffee and was simply, quietly, unexpectedly, entirely at peace.